Hello everyone and welcome back to For Fun and Profit. My name is Basilisk and I am still your host, so let's get started. Now then, today's subject is going to be much closer to a standard review than most of my content because I feel the need to talk about a game called The Witcher, and this is the best way to go about it. So let's just get into things, shall we? Now, it is worth noting that I'm only going to be talking about the very first Witcher. I won't be talking about The Witcher 2 or The Witcher 3 as I haven't played either of them yet. In addition, even after playing The Witcher for about 12 hours, I'm not sure if the game qualifies more as an action RPG or a Western RPG. It's a weird combination of the two that doesn't mesh super well in this game, but I'll get more into that as we go on. Now, just about the very first thing the player will notice when they start up the game is that the models look very late PlayStation 2 or early PlayStation 3. The game came out in 2007, and the character and enemy models have not aged well. They're very stiff and awkward. They're very stiff and awkward. Need to. Sorry, my brain shut down for a moment. However, there are a few notable oddities beyond that. Most notably, the player will be able to tell an important character pretty much at a glance because the important characters have special models. Now, that may not sound like something that's that big a deal, because that's usually the case, right? The thing is, it's more noticeable in The Witcher than it is in most other Western RPGs or action RPGs, because there's maybe 10 models used for generic NPCs in the entire game. The only difference between them is the color. This gets really weird at times. At one point in Chapter 2, I ran into 3 of the main antagonists for Chapter 1, all walking in a row. Later on, I ran into an important merchant standing right next to an unimportant merchant, with the only difference between the two being the color of their clothes. I get this game was made by a novice, at the time, studio, with a budget of one single area in a BioWare game, but it's still really jarring to see. This gets driven home once the characters start talking. Every single character in this game is fully voiced, and all but the absolute most important characters are voiced by about 3 people. It's not necessarily a huge problem, but it kinda highlights that giving voices to every random jagoff you can interact with isn't the kind of thing that's necessary, nor even really that good of an idea. I don't think anyone would have complained if talking to some putsy book salesman just kicked you straight to the shop screen. The voice acting issue is made worse by the fact that the voice acting is not great. Geralt in particular has some horrifically botched delivery. At one point towards the end of Chapter 1, Geralt gives what is supposed to be an angry, chilling speech to a lynch mob, but it sounds more like he's annoyed that they interrupted his tea. It's more bored and slightly annoyed than anything angry and threatening. However, despite the quality of the voice acting, the writing itself was actually pretty solid. There's a really good grasp of proper timing and pacing on display, and the script thankfully resists the apparent mass temptation video game writers have to turn every character into a quipping, sarcastic wisecracker. While there's nothing inherently wrong with that character type, it's nice to see a professional mercenary monster hunter type of character act like he takes his job very seriously. In addition, the world building is fantastic. The world of The Witcher feels alive and natural, and people have logical reactions to the infestation of monsters, at least to an extent. There's a few cases of idiots being idiots, but even in the context of the world, they're supposed to be acting like idiots, which is nice to see. The flavor text is also really good, but it's pretty dry. The idea seems to be that Geralt is writing the journal, and as Geralt is, as I mentioned before, a very serious person, the flavor text and journal entries tend to be very straight and to the point. It makes sense, but there are times when a bit more personality to the journal would have been very welcome. One place that the writing does falter is when the player is making choices. This is a big part of the reason why I'm not sure as to the game's dominant genre. And there are choices for the player to make, and they do have repercussions, but there doesn't seem to be a way for the player to intuit or see any of the repercussions coming on a first playthrough. For instance, in Chapter 1 you can sell weapons to some elven freedom fighter rebel types. It never comes up again in Chapter 1, but once you get to Chapter 2, you meet a jackass gambler. If you sold weapons to the elves, the fellow turns up dead just as it becomes relevant to the main plot of the game. On the one hand, this is a neat bit of world building, and the game does explain the cause and effect after the fact. On the other hand, this is the sort of thing that can be really frustrating, as it means the player is essentially choosing blinds in regards to the kind of side effects that making a choice can have. What makes this worse is the way the choices are worded, as the choices are usually very dryly worded, and don't give much of a hint as to the potential consequence. All in all, though, I'll take this over completely meaningless choices, I suppose, but a bit more lead would have been nice. Another point is the music, or rather the lack thereof. Sorry, hiccups. Most of the soundtrack seems to be ambient noise and mood music. There isn't anything in the way of memorable or even really noticeable songs, and what there is doesn't even really suit the environments or the situation. It's just there, I guess. Like they had a soundtrack budget that they had to spend but didn't have any real ideas for it. It's not great. But enough about writing and aesthetics, let's talk game mechanics. Unfortunately, this is where the game really starts to let itself down. There's 4 mechanics of note, and all of them have problems. The first is the character progression itself. The way this works is that you get a number of bronze, silver, gold talents as you level up. These talents are then spent on skills in the hero menu, but only when you meditate at a bonfire. This mostly works fine, but a lot of the upgrades seem really minor. I certainly never felt like Geralt was notably stronger 12 hours into the game than he was when I started it. Maybe this becomes more apparent as you get farther into the game, but if so, it really comes into effect too late. And the second mechanic of note is the camera. Now, there's 2 possible cameras in the game, and both of them are terrible. The first is a top-down isometric camera that is really awkward to use, especially if you're like me and have a 2-monitor setup. What's worse is that this camera has a negative effect on the world design for The Witcher. Isometric cameras don't work well in full 3D, so in order to get around the limitations of it, at no point in The Witcher can Geralt go under things. Bridges and such are either completely solid or have invisible walls on their undersides for the sake of the isometric camera. It's a very awkward compromise and kind of jars you out of the experience when you run into it. However, the second camera type, the over-the-shoulder camera, isn't much better. Certainly, it's easier to move around in this viewpoint, but there's some serious problems here. The first is that moving the camera feels oddly stiff and jerky. Like, it doesn't respond to mouse movements very well. I know diehard PC fans swear by mouse and keyboard, but in this case, being able to map the camera to a joystick would have been really nice because it does not like the mouse. Another problem with the over-the-shoulder camera is that it is literally an over-the-shoulder camera. Geralt stands slightly to the left or the right of the camera, and generally seems to be looking straight ahead, but the cursor is always at the center of the camera. This results in the player generally needing to click a bit to the left or the right of where they think they should be. For those who have played Resident Evil 4, imagine the entire game being played with the camera used when Leon goes into a firing stance. It's really just terrible. In fact, it's even worse because, at least in Resident Evil 4, when Leon goes into a firing stance, the camera pulls in, so it's a lot closer. With The Witcher, the over-the-shoulder camera is pulled back and it's farther away, which just makes it even awkward. Geralt never looks like he's looking at what you're clicking at. The next mechanic is alchemy, the art of mixing things. There's a few things to mix, and the most notable are potions of varying types and of buffs and the greases you wipe. Wow! Okay, let's try that sentence again. There's a few things to mix, but the most notable are potions of varying types of buffs and the greases you wipe on your sword to give you damage boost against certain types of enemies. This works well enough on its own, but the problem is that alchemy is weirdly restricted and not very well explained. First off, the game never tells you that you need to meditate in order to use alchemy outside of a character telling Geralt to rest by a fire while he crafts a story-critical potion during the prologue. There's already a problem of poor conveyance of information, but this is admittedly prior in the long run. The biggest problem comes with the complete lack of helpful feedback when using alchemy. To use alchemy, you need a base material and a certain number of ingredient types. Now, each ingredient tells you what types of ingredients it counts as, and each base tells you its strength as a base and what you can use it to make, which is all really good. The problem is that if you try to use alchemy without the right base ingredient, the game just says you need a stronger base, and leaves you to figure out what strength of base you need. Since the Witcher is actually rather stingy with gold and buying things is expensive, You need to be very careful with your ingredients and your gold, so the player is discouraged from experimenting or buying ingredients to see if it's the one they need. The limited inventory really does no favors here either. However, all of this was annoying, but tolerable. The clever writing, sorry, my eye broke. That was weird. Everything just went blurry for a moment. Anyways, the clever writing and expert world building was enough to keep me sailing through the game. Slowly. What ultimately made me realize that I was unlikely to finish The Witcher, and then ultimately made me give up on the game, was, well, the combat. See, the combat is the worst part of this game, the part that is unfortunately rather prominent, and the part that is just tedious, frustrating, dull at best. Or sorry, the combat in The Witcher is at best tedious and dull, and frustrating and sticky at worst. Yeah, okay. Sorry, I read two sentences at once there, it was terrible. The basic idea of the combat is that Geralt, as a Witcher, has two swords. A steel sword for dealing with human enemies, and a silver sword for dealing with monsters. Hiccups. This sounds fine at first, but switching between swords to deal with the right enemy types. That's fine on paper, and it actually does work fairly alright, barring that the game doesn't give you the silver sword until the beginning of Chapter 2, about 8 or so hours into the game. The player has magical signs of varying use as well, but the game gives you Ard and Igni, basically a force push and a fire spell, early in the game, and these are both really useful, especially Igni. These are, again, pretty much fine, and the only real issue is that the game keeps defaulting you to Ard, even if you haven't used the sign in a couple of fights, which can trip you up. However, there are two systems in the combat mechanics that are utterly horrible. The first is the way combat itself flows. Instead of just clicking on enemies or using hotkeys or button combinations to pull off special abilities and combos, combat in The Witcher has a weird rhythm game style element to it, where you have to attack enemies again at a certain time in order to keep the combo going. If you miss, it leaves Geralt open to attack, but if you hit, it can generally stun lock an enemy. This isn't so bad on its own, but the issue is the timing, which is generally about a second or so later than it feels like it should be. So attacks don't flow into each other very smoothly at all. It can also get really annoying at times, especially in dealing with cannon fodder enemies, because combos are really the only way to do consistent damage. Another big problem is the stance system. Each of Geralt's swords has three fighting styles: strong, fast, and group. The idea is that you change fighting styles based on the enemies you're fighting. Strong, slow bastards are best handled with strong style and don't take much damage from fast or group styles. Quick, nimble enemies need the fast style and will avoid strong style or knock you out of group style. Groups of weak enemies constantly interrupt the strong and fast style, but get knocked around like cream crackers with the group style. This probably sounds fine on paper, but in execution it's really awkward. It's rarely clear what kind of style you need, especially when fighting human enemies, and sometimes it's not clear if a style is working or not. This gets really awkward when you're fighting groups of enemies that need different styles, especially since Geralt targets whatever you're looking at instead of the last thing you clicked on. Since enemies aren't weak to the style you're using, can interrupt your attacks while you're trying to focus on a troublesome opponent, and this gets worse. This gets worse when you're towards the end of Chapter 1 and into Chapter 2. Let me explain. When you fight, towards the end of Chapter 1, you fight a monster called the Beast and a horde of Barghest, basically dogs, demon dogs. This fight will work you over pretty well if you don't have a strong grasp of the fighting styles and will give you trouble regardless. After the fight with the Beast, the game never really drops the focus on fighting enemy groups that require multiple styles, barring the ever-present gangs of drowners that you slap away with group style the way a cow slaps away flies. Because of this, combat becomes really annoying and tedious really quickly. Switching styles takes a moment, and there's very little feedback to tell you if you're damaging an enemy or using the correct style for the enemy. This is ultimately what made me give up on The Witcher. Combat is tedious, slow-paced, really focused on, frustrating, and ultimately just not the least bit enjoyable for me. I love the world building and the writing, and I can tolerate the rest of the awkward mechanics and the aesthetics, but the terrible combat just finally killed the game for me, since almost every single quest involves fighting several mixed groups of enemies. It's frustrating too, because I really wanted to like The Witcher, but I could never play the game for more than an hour or two at a time, because before all the combat made me put the game down and go play something better. With each tedious, frustrating fight, the annoyance just kept building and eventually got too much about halfway through Chapter 2. Although one thing I will admit about the combat in The Witcher is that was nice about the combat in The Witcher, rather, is that the enemies are very nicely varied and distinct. If the combat was better, I could get into fighting different types of enemies just to see them all Monster Hunter style. In the end, though, The Witcher is an excellent example of a potentially great game that just gets utterly butchered by one poorly executed mechanic. These cases are rare, to be fair. Most of the time it takes a few things to bring down a game, but it can happen. However, I have been told that The Witcher 2 and The Witcher 3 fix most of these problems, especially the combat, and I do plan to check them out. I already own The Witcher 2 at time of writing, and I'm hoping to have The Witcher 3 by the time this video goes live. Now, that wraps up this episode of For Fun and Profit. I do hope you all enjoyed it, and I will see you all here next time to talk about fighting game stories. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all then. Thank you, and good night, folks.